Welcome to Holding the Line podcast about cops, courts, and crime. I'm Jason Johnson, president of the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund, joined by my co-host Sean Kennedy. We're going to pick up from another recent episode where we introduced the idea of the distance between public perception around police use of force and its prevalence. And the public perception is that police violence, as they call it, is just a major, major problem. The public generally in polls way overestimates the incidents in which officers use force of any kind, and especially overestimate the prevalence of deadly force. And then there's another component in which it seems that the public way overestimates sort of the racial disparities that actually, in depending on the study you look at, really just don't even exist in police use of force and in particular in police deadly force. And we just know this by looking at polls that have been done and studies that have been done. And, these aren't right-wing think tank polls or studies. These are, major academic institutions across America. So there's this survey that was done by the Manhattan Institute. They ask people, they conduct a survey like surveys are done. They're asking people what they believe in terms of police use of deadly force. The results of this survey that was published shows that people way overestimate the number of times that police officers use deadly force. And in particular, they way overestimate the number of times police use deadly force against Black Americans.
The number of estimated unarmed people shot, according to them, was 4 times for whites. They said that there were 1,600 unarmed whites killed in a in a given year or period of time in 2015 to 2022. In fact, there were 450. They said, or total shot was 1,600, but there were actually 450. The number of shot unarmed, they said, was 300, which, if you think about that, they're saying a huge number, a huge percentage, 20% or so of all those shot by police were unarmed, when in fact it was 26. So it was
26,
5%
just to be clear,
whites,
26, not 126, not 2,600, 26.
26 whites. Yeah, and that's the reality. And then the same group of people said that 4,000 blacks were shot over that period. The real number was uh, 238. And then uh, for unarmed black fatally shot, they said 1,800 were unarmed of the 4,000. And the fact the real number in a given year was 23, according to the period that the Manhattan Institute surveyed. We have gone through the Washington Post database in detail. And if you really dig into it, it's actually less than 20 in any given year. Some years it's over, it's 23 in this case. But just this in 2023, I just was perusing their data. The number is 16. So there are 16 unarmed blacks killed in a year, according to the Washington Post. But we'll get into greater detail about what's going on in the Washington Post data, which is called fatal force and is probably both academically and publicly the most highly cited research survey database about police shootings, fatal police shootings. But what the Manhattan Institute survey does is it confirms another poll that we actually commissioned with the TIPP survey company. And in that survey, we found strikingly similar data that 53% of people believe that police shootings have increased since 2000, which, in fact, as we mentioned in previous podcasts, they have declined dramatically, total shootings. 29% believe that the police kill over 500 unarmed people a year. And the Manhattan Institute and the Skeptic survey that were done around George Floyd, it was done after Floyd in 2021, show the number is even higher. Some people thought it was 10,000 a year who were unarmed and killed by police in a given year. And 46% believe police kill more blacks than whites every year. But each one of those is not only false, it's off by a wild order of magnitude. What does this mean when we talk about myths? If you're on the beat as an officer, what does it mean when you're interacting with the community and they perceive that there's racism in the use of force or that police violence is endemic? What does that mean in a practical sense for law enforcement on the street?
It makes it very difficult to get people to interact in sort of a normal way with law enforcement. So, the vast majority of the people that law enforcement officers interact with are not criminals. They're just normal people. I mean, of all different races and backgrounds. Police interact. I mean, I don't even know how you would count the number of times, but there's just so many different types of interactions that police have with business owners, members of the community. These are not in an even in an enforcement capacity, but then you add onto that all the people that police interact with in what you would call an enforcement capacity, whether it's a traffic stop or stop of an individual who's not driving a car, or a response to a 911 call, or even taking a crime report. All of these people have been influenced. I mean, the vast majority of people have been influenced by these prevailing narratives. It erodes their trust in law enforcement. So if it is in an enforcement capacity, people become defensive. They're afraid that even though there's no reason for the police to use force against them in many cases, they're afraid that the police will. And it just becomes even more acute when you're dealing with a person, particularly for a white police officer, but really for any police officer, to be dealing with a person who is at heightened concern because they've been told they should be at heightened concern. Um, um, when they're dealing with the police. And so it becomes a much more strained interaction. It becomes a more volatile interaction. And again, the people who are not in the non-enforcement context, they also have less trust of law enforcement because they've been told they should have less trust for law enforcement. So they're less forthcoming. They're less willing to share information that might be helpful to solve other crimes. They're less likely to report crimes when they've been a victim because they don't want to have any interaction whatsoever with law enforcement because they've been told it's dangerous. And so those effects, I don't know how you measure the impact of those, but those are real on the ground impacts. And not to mention the policy. I mean, politicians feel moved to pursue bad policy because their constituents feel there's a risk of something that really there isn't.
Well, to the last point, and then I'll come back to your first point about how we estimate the total number of times police in a given year encounter the public. But the last point about willingness to cooperate with the police, we have something from the Department of Justice called the National Crime Victimization Survey, and it shows dramatic underreporting, especially of violent crimes like assaults. The most common and highly reported crime as a percentage of the total number of times people are victimized versus the time it ends up in a police report is auto theft. And the reason is because your insurance company's not going to pay you for your car if it gets stolen unless you tell the cops. But everything else is often under 50% of all violent crimes and serious larcenies and thefts are just not reported. So people are not calling the cops either because they won't bother or whatever, but a striking thing happens in aggravated assaults. And this is dangerous for you and I as a member of the public, not as a member of law enforcement. 25% of people who are victims of aggravated assaults, when they're asked why they didn't report it to the cops, they say they're going to take care of it themselves. Are we not asking for trouble when people are going to be vigilantes and get revenge on people that hurt them and not deal with the law enforcement and the justice system? We're going to talk about obviously, retaliation and victimization in other podcasts, but that is a deeply concerning thing when people are not using official avenues to exact justice. You're asking for trouble. But in the terms of the total number of police encounters, the Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Statistics estimates there are about 60 million police encounters between the public and police in a given year. 60 million. Of those, 0.003% result in a fatal shooting or injury. Not I, and that and we what we know from academic studies is there's approximately 1,000 fatal shootings and another 1,000 or so, even more, a few more shootings that don't result in death. So just give you a scale, there are 60 million and 0.003 that works out to 1 in 56,000 times that the police encounter someone, does someone get shot fatally by the police. So the scale is kind of off the charts. So if you take this as sort of an inverted pyramid, the next question, Jason, is how many of those people are unarmed, do you think?
I mean, um, Unfortunately, I already kinda know the answer.
Well, you do, but what does the American public think it is? They think it's almost everybody.
Yeah, it's like everybody. That's the problem. And in a moment, we're gonna talk about unarmed doesn't necessarily mean if a police shoot an unarmed person, that doesn't 100% of the time mean they're not justified uses of deadly force, but it is a proxy that we it's kind of a shorthand that people have gotten accustomed to that like, "Oh, the police shot an unarmed person." Well, okay, it may be unjustified. We don't know. We need to know the facts, but that doesn't always mean it's unjustified. There could be many scenarios where like the person was trying to disarm the police officer. And right now we're transitioning into talking about the Washington Post database and a critique of it. But there are situations where the person was actually trying to disarm a law enforcement officer at the time that deadly force was used, and that goes down for all time as being an unarmed person. Okay, well, they were unarmed when it started, but they were trying to unarm a cop or disarm a cop. So I don't know. Can we really count that as an unarmed person?
Well, I mean, and that's the definitional game that people who are trying to push a narrative are playing is
Sure.
they attach this moniker of unarmed, and it's unarmed in what context? And the study just came out by Ian Adams and Justin Nix, respectively, of the University of South Carolina and the University of Nebraska. And their study found that when you control for contextual factors and the criminal history, prior prevalence of violence of someone, and we just had Officer Mark Wagner on, Special Agent Mark Wagner from Wisconsin, where this was, part of the recipe for why he was involved in a police shooting that wasn't fatal, but still was the person had a violent history. And so if his encounter with that person was knowing that that person had prior used firearm violence against others. So the odds that firearm violence would be involved in this warrant execution were higher than zero. So when we talk about that, the total number of unarmed people in the Washington Post database is striking because it's not very high. It's a small fraction of that. But what everybody focuses on is race and what that is. So the Washington Post says this is the number of unarmed people. And then you go, okay, well, that must be all unjustified, felonious murders by police, these brutal, racist, whatever. Then you look down, and in the period of the study that we did called Fatal Falsehoods about this thing, the Washington Post database called Fatal Force, we pulled their raw data. And in their raw data, they break down incident after incident after incident. So we took every unarmed black person who was killed in the 2016 to 2022 period. We identified 118 of them according to their categorization of unarmed. Of those, 51 attacked the police, 12 threatened them, 18 moved in a violent, jerky way, 13 fled after being directed or whatever, and 24 were listed as other. And it was an undetermined threat type. So, in other words, the details were not clear to the Washington Post.
I don't know what year it started, Sean. You probably know.
2015.
2015. Okay, that's when the Washington Post decided that they were going to begin maintaining a database of fatal uses of deadly force by law enforcement. And where it's and you'll fill in the blanks here, Sean, but, like, this is a media organization. They collect um, essentially what they put down as the facts of the case. They don't come from official law enforcement sources. They're not looking in investigative files from the actual investigative agencies. They are collecting information based solely on media reports, which, of course, right away, it's kind of like the old saying is like garbage in, garbage out. Okay, so you're already getting a less than perfect source of information, but they're getting what is readily available. Okay, I get it. They're not launching a new investigation. They're just collecting whatever's available out in the public sphere. They're putting it into a database, and that is like that. By the way, and this is a shame, and we don't like that this is the case, but that is actually the Washington Post database is probably one of the most reliable. So even though we're getting ready to explain how it's not really reliable, there is no other place you can go that the public can go and actually learn in detail whether it's accurate or inaccurate. That is the source. That is the place that you go. There is no government sponsored database that we can go to.
There is very limited information because of the way reporting is done. So they're open source crowdsourcing or another couple of mapping police violence and other databases that are run exclusively by activists. They crowdsource, but this is the Washington Post identifying cases based on media reports. The problem is how they classify it. Now, the helpful part about the Washington Post Fatal Force is that they have a widget, and that widget allows you to sort and filter by different categories, which we did. But then they do something which, again, is a credit to them in terms of transparency. They post their raw data in something called GitHub, and basically it's giant spreadsheets. So in that, they have data they hide from their widget. And we dug into their classification and then we fact checked them because one of the other things the Washington Post does is only lists what the first blush media report said. And what later came out in grand juries or in subsequent police investigations is whitewashed out of the story. And it's often, the family of the person shot or some civil rights leader claiming it's, this horrible racist incident. They didn't do anything. But of those unarmed blacks identified in the 2016 to 2022 period, the vast majority were identified as actually being a threat to law enforcement or a third party, even though they were not unarmed in a reasonable sense. And I'll give you a couple examples. There was an individual in California named Kyle Dale who raised a firearm towards officers while resisting arrest, dropping it only milliseconds before, or it was in California, it was Dallas, only milliseconds before he was shot by police in Dallas, Texas. This is on body cam and on the 7-Eleven or Kmart security footage. He was armed. He pointed it at the cops and he dropped it right before the shot was fired. And I mean milliseconds. If you watch the footage, the idea that he was unarmed and didn't pose a threat to the police is crazy, but the Washington Post lists him as unarmed. There's other errors. There's a great example of a man named Virgil Wolford, who's not identified as unarmed, but is unidentified as a black man. And he was killed by police, which would be shocking to Virgil because he survived, because he shot his girlfriend and tried to shoot the cops. And he even asked the cops to kill him on the spot, but they didn't. And so he went to prison. So it's shocking to say that he was killed by police since he survived and spent 3 years in prison after this shooting. Um, and we went through this whole database and we found incident after incident after incident where people are described as unarmed and they either possessed a gun or they committed some other threat or attack on police. And I just did this with the latest data because our report was released in 2024, but we stopped it in 2022 because the data wasn't updated fully. It wasn't all verified or double checked. And there were a couple shootings. Just I literally clicked through 3 of the 16 instances. In one case, the individual was not armed. Jason, he wasn't armed. But in Oakland County, Michigan, outside of Detroit, he approached the police, hid behind something, and popped out, pointing his hands as finger guns at the cops. As a police officer, is that a good idea?
No, I would say that that is not, that's not something I would advise anyone to do. But
I,
that's
I
an
don't think.
example of, like, it goes down officially as the person is unarmed, but again, that's not, that's not the end of the story. There's more to it, and that's one example of where even an unarmed person, might be shot by the police, and it might be perfectly legally justified based on the circumstances. So it's not really, armed versus unarmed isn't always the right it's never the right way to actually approach the question. It's just some shorthand that we've come up with somehow. But as you're detailing here, the Washington Post database is unfortunately what we have to go by. It's, there's not a whole lot else out there. But even if you take it as being 100% accurate, it still proves the point that law enforcement officers do not use anywhere near the amount of deadly force that people think. And then when you really dig into the facts and find out, wow, it actually overstates it by quite a bit because of these inaccuracies you're pointing out here.
Yeah, it's kind of shocking to see, one, that if you actually look at the data, the public perception is wrong, assuming the data is right, and then the data itself overstates it. So it's kind of a building blocks where we have this perception of excessive, fatal shootings, then the actual data from even activists is much less than what the public believes. And then when you get to the actual, what actually happened in those circumstances of those fatal shootings, the number of people who were involved in unjustified shootings by police is infinitesimal. And one of the other 2 cases, and this is what's important here, is this is just at random. I picked 3 of the 16. I just clicked on them. I didn't look at any of the details. The other one was a guy in Memphis. He gets stopped at a traffic stop. He's told to get out of the car and don't get back in the car. So the officer is approaching him to make the traffic stop, potentially, search him and make an arrest or whatever. The guy jumps in the car and the officer tries to pull him out and he speeds off with the cop in the car and the cop fatally shoots him. So in most cases, that's the use of a vehicle armed with a vehicle, but the Washington Post calls him unarmed. And then in another incident on the flip side, there was a case where a guy was running from the cops. He turned a corner, basically startled the officer, and the officer fired. The officer is now being charged with murder. So there are repercussions when cops get it wrong. It's not that they're not charged. They are charged. Now, what happens in the court of law is something we deal with all the time. Some of these charges are bogus many times, but when they're not bogus, just we want to see people be brought to justice as much as anyone else. So it's not like they aren't being charged and there's that. And speaking of not being charged, the guy in the Memphis traffic stop, who decided not to charge him? Our friend in Memphis, the DA there, Steve Mulroy, who, if you know anything about Memphis DA Steve Mulroy, not only was he funded by George Soros, but he's got to be one of the most anti-police prosecutors in the country. So if he's saying it's a justified shooting, I don't know who you're going to take it from.
Must be super justified. So, yeah, so you made an important point there. Like, there are like our critique here doesn't mean that every single time a police officer makes a decision of any kind, whether it's to use force, to make an arrest, to use deadly force, there are incidents in which officers make mistakes. There's no getting around that. And we're not saying it never ever happens. What we're saying is it happens so rarely. It has dominated the public conversation, and they have had such a negative impact on law enforcement for the last 10 or so years. We have a recruiting crisis where people don't want to be cops anymore. Not just because they don't want to be subject to this kind of scrutiny, it's because literally their idea of what cops are has changed because they've been influenced by what they see and what they hear. And they're not looking at the actual facts that we're looking at. They're not looking at academic studies. So that's what we're trying to do is try to bring the public conversation closer to what the reality and the facts are. And that's all we're trying to do here. And to help people understand that by and large, the overwhelming majority of law enforcement officers are out here doing the right thing for the right reason. And they are not racist. They are not trigger happy. The number of law enforcement officers that go an entire career, 20, 25, 30 years or more, and never ever use deadly force, it's extraordinarily high. I think it's higher than 95%
It
of
is
law enforcement
95%. It's 90, not
that
even deadly force. No, never fire their weapon
never fire their weapons. So
in the line of duty.
And so, like, most police officers make it an entire career and never, other than at the range, shooting at a paper target, never use deadly force against anyone. And I don't think we have a number on if we put that out as a poll question, or survey question, what would people respond to that? Like, they probably would say 95% do have fired their weapon at work. It's probably the exact opposite. I mean, just based on kind of what we see. So, the whole idea is just that the public conversation has just gotten so far away from the reality, and then that's we just need to pull it closer. And again, so many state laws have been enacted in response to this belief that police officers are the enemy. There's been bills in Congress. Fortunately, I don't think any of them have passed, but there was an effort to create federal laws around this perception that didn't quite make it, but I'm sure there will be more in the future. Um, there are, just reading some headlines from our report in addition to some of the voices that we played before, but like headlines: police brutality is a public health crisis. Police violence remains high concern in U.S. 3 in 4 consider police violence against public a serious problem. These kinds of things they're actually quite harmful in so many ways. We could, having a whole other episode on how all the various ways that it's a problem, but it's clearly a problem. And as things reach the headlines, new stories or high profile incidents involving police use of force, we're gonna cover those in real time. So we appreciate you joining us again on Holding the Line, a podcast about cops, courts, and crime. If you enjoy our podcast, please give us a 5-star review on the podcast platform of your choice. Continue sending us your feedback. We certainly appreciate that. And your ideas about future shows in particular is super helpful. And we definitely take those into strong consideration. Thanks again for joining us. We'll catch you next time.